3.5 hours now since the first reports of gunfire was heard.
Gavin Lee in Brussels for us, thank you. And joining us now is Jonathan Schanzer, a counter-terrorism expert at the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies. Jonathan, what strikes you about this attack in Strasbourg?
Well, I think a number of things. Number one is that I think Christmas has become, unfortunately, a target of extremists. We've seen this in the past, certainly in Berlin in 2016. We also know that this particular market has been a target of al-Qaeda dating back to 2000. I was reminded today of an attack that was scuttled by French and German authorities in this very market 18 years ago. So that is, I think both of these are ongoing concerns. We've seen these vehicular attacks and attacks on soft targets across Europe. And I would say that despite some of the claims that al-Qaeda or ISIS are on the wane, we're still seeing these sorts of attacks regularly across the European continent.
And what do you make of the fact that the suspect was apparently known to the police, and already the French counter-terrorism prosecutor has opened an investigation?
Well, I think this points to the fact that there are a great number of individuals that authorities are tasked with trying to track, and it is simply impossible to track all of them. I think the authorities across Europe are really drowning in the number of leads that they have. What's more interesting is that there may have been a raid on this individual's home and that he was allowed to escape their dragnet, which may have ultimately prompted this man to engage in what we would now see as a desperate act. But of course, we're still, I think, receiving information still sketchy, but that to me was a very important point that Gavin had just pointed out.
And in other attacks that we've seen on the street in Europe, they've been knife attacks, they've been vehicle attacks, but this seems to be a gun attack, and it's much more difficult to get guns in Europe than it is here in the United States, isn't it? So how significant does that strike you as being?
It's significant in the sense that, you know, it's likely that this person had support. In other words, to get access to guns and to ammunition probably requires a network of people involved in smuggling and gun running. And this actually does raise the question of whether this was tied to perhaps a broader network in North Africa. And the reason why I raise that, and of course we still don't know a lot, and so I'll put that caveat out there, but we did see today a statement put out by al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb. This is the North African affiliate of al-Qaeda, exhorting its followers to carry out attacks inside France, and then of course several hours later we see this attack. So it'll be interesting to learn from authorities whether they believe this was inspired, at least in part, by this missive.
And how much do you think intelligence agencies in France and in Belgium have learned since the attacks in 2015?
Look, I think the threat has remained somewhat static. I think maybe there was a fear at one point as ISIS was being driven out of Syria and Iraq that perhaps you would see a greater number of people move to Europe or the countries where they initially came from, and there could have been a concern over that. But overall, the threat has been a rather static one. We know that there are soft targets. We know that there are too many people to track. It's impossible to stay on top of all of this. So it's always a question of when, not if. I think it's the same question that we have here in the United States, around the world. We are very vulnerable to these attacks, and the best thing that they can do is to just try to stay on top of as many of the high-value targets as possible.
Jonathan Schanzer, thank you so much for that analysis there.
Pleasure.